I want to talk to you today about one of the most important numbers in medicine that most people have either never heard of, or if they have heard of it, don't really understand what it means or why it matters. And that number is your HbA1c or A1c if you're in America. And here's the thing about HbA1c. It's one of the most powerful predictors of future disease that we currently have. And it's not just about diabetes. We're talking about heart disease, kidney failure, nerve damage, stroke, dementia, cancer. The list goes on. And what makes it really insidious, what makes it genuinely so scary from a clinical perspective, is that you can feel completely fine while it's quietly rising in the background. No symptoms, no warning signs, just your biology slowly moving in the wrong direction. Now, I spent nearly a decade working in emergency medicine in some of the busiest AANA departments in the UK, and something I noticed quite early on is that metabolic disease almost never appears suddenly. When someone comes in with their first complication or illness like kidney failure or a heart attack at the age of 53 or a stroke or an infection that won't heal, that is not a sudden event. That's the end point of a process that started years, if not decades earlier. The HbA1c was telling the story the whole time, but nobody was listening. So today I want to go through 15 scientifically backed ways to lower your A1c. Some of these are pretty big levers, the kind of changes that move the needle significantly. Some of them are refinements, but what I really want you to understand is that these work as a system. They compound, and if you genuinely implement all 15 of these, if you kept everything else constant and rechecked your HbA1c in 3 months' time, which is exactly the timescale that we use clinically, I would bet a lot of money that your results would have fallen. But before we get into the interventions, let me just give you a quick primer because this is important context and it will make everything else make a lot more sense. So HbA1c basically stands for glycated hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein inside your red blood cells that carries oxygen around the body. When glucose blood sugar is floating in your bloodstream, it sticks to that hemoglobin irreversibly. The more glucose in your blood over time, the more hemoglobin gets coated in it. And HbA1c measures what percentage has been glycated. It's essentially a 3-month average of your blood glucose levels. And the reason we use 3 months is because that's the lifespan of a red blood cell. Old cells die and new cells form, so it's like a rolling average and it's incredibly hard to cheat. In the UK, HbA1c is reported in millimode moles per mole, so below 42 is normal, 42 to 47 is pre-diabetes, and then 48 and above is diabetes. If you're in the US, the same test is reported as a percentage. Below 5.7 is normal, 5.7 to 6.4 is pre-diabetes, and then 6.5 and above is diabetes. And what we're trying to do fundamentally with all 15 of these interventions is improve insulin sensitivity and reduce chronic glucose exposure. Those are the two main levers. Everything we're about to talk about works through one or both of these mechanisms. So let's start with probably the most obvious one, but also one of the most powerful, which is reducing refined carbohydrates and added sugars. So refined carbs like white bread, white rice, pastries, cereals, obviously sugary drinks, sometimes protein bars, sometimes certain health foods. These hit your bloodstream really fast. They cause rapid glucose spikes and frequent glucose spikes over time, push your HbA1c up, even if your fasting glucose looks completely normal on a standard blood test. And liquid sugar is particularly problematic. When you drink something sweet, you bypass a lot of the normal satiety signaling that slows absorption. Your blood glucose goes up faster and higher than it would from the equivalent calories eaten as solid food. Now, this obviously isn't about eliminating all carbs, specifically about removing the most metabolically dangerous ones, the ones that spike you hardest and give you very little nutritional return. Now, building on that in number 2, the next thing is increasing dietary fiber, and I'd say aiming for somewhere between 30 and 40 or even 50 grams a day. Most people in the UK are getting around half of that. Now, what fiber does is it slows carbohydrate absorption. It forms sort of a kind of gel in your gut that blunts the rate at which glucose enters your bloodstream. And what that means is lower post-meal spikes, but it also feeds your gut microbiome. And we now have pretty good evidence that gut microbiome composition directly influences insulin sensitivity. So fiber is doing multiple things at once. And these include vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. These are your main sources of really good fiber. Number 3 on the list is all about protein, and protein is really underappreciated in this sort of conversation. When you eat protein with a meal, it has a significant blunting effect on your glucose response. It slows your stomach emptying, it stimulates insulin in a more controlled way, and it improves satiety, so you eat less overall. And there's also something really interesting about protein at breakfast specifically. A study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that a high-protein breakfast reduced glucose excursions across the rest of the day, compared to a high-carbohydrate breakfast. As well as all of that, protein also preserves muscle mass during fat loss, which matters for reasons that I'll come back to in a minute. Now, in my experience, a lot of people who are trying to improve their metabolic health are significantly under-eating protein even without realizing it. So that's a good number that you could start checking every day from now on. Now, in terms of overall dietary patterns, the Mediterranean diet has probably the strongest randomized control trial evidence of any dietary approach for improving glycemic control. The PREDIME trial, which is a large Spanish study involving nearly 7,500 people, showed significant improvements in cardiovascular and metabolic outcomes in people following this Mediterranean dietary pattern supplemented with extra virgin olive oil or nuts compared to a low-fat control diet. And I think the reason this works so well isn't one single thing. It's the combination, high in extra virgin olive oil and vegetables, legumes, fish, nuts, but then also low in ultra-processed food. What's really interesting is that improvements in insulin sensitivity were seen even without aggressive calorie restriction. These people aren't eating less, they're just eating differently. So all of this sort of translates into the quality of the food is doing the work. Which brings me on to weight loss at number 5. So if you're carrying excess weight, even modest weight loss, we're talking 5 to 10% of your body weight. This produces significant reductions in HbA1c. The mechanism here is primarily about visceral fat, which is the fat stored around your internal organs. Visceral fat, as I've mentioned many times, is metabolically active in a way that subcutaneous fat, the fat that you can pinch under your skin, isn't. It drives inflammation, it directly worsens insulin resistance, and it increases the fat in your liver, which has enormous consequences for glucose metabolism. The DIRECT trial, which is this famous trial that came out of Newcastle and Glasgow, showed that nearly half of participants with type 2 diabetes achieved remission through sustained dietary weight loss. This is remission, not just improvement. The goal isn't rapid weight loss. Crash diets rarely produce sustained benefit. The goal is sustained fat loss, particularly that visceral fat around your middle. Moving on to number 6, and here's one that people consistently underestimate, and that one is resistance training. So skeletal muscle, which is the muscle that you can see on your bones, is the primary site of glucose disposal in the human body. When your muscles contract, they take up glucose from the bloodstream independently of insulin. There's a whole separate glucose uptake pathway mediated by something called GLUT4 transporters, GLUT transporters, that gets activated by muscle contraction alone. Building and maintaining muscle mass is one of the most powerful things that you can do for your long-term metabolic health. And we have solid data showing that resistance training lowers your HbA1c independent of any weight loss. A meta-analysis published in Sports Medicine looked at over 30 different trials and found really meaningful HbA1c reductions from resistance training alone. So what I would say is 2 to 4 sessions a week is genuinely enough to see some benefits. You don't need to be in a gym 6 days a week. Now, aerobic exercise at number 7 works through a slightly different mechanism. It improves your mitochondrial function. It increases the density of insulin receptors on your cells and improves your body's ability to use glucose as fuel. The HbA1c reduction from aerobic exercise is dose-dependent, meaning that more is generally better, but the relationship isn't quite linear. What matters most is consistency. Simply a 30-minute walk every day will do more for your HbA1c than an intense 2-hour session once a week, and then nothing else. If you really wanted to push it, then a 30-minute walk after every meal would do wonders for your blood sugar. Moving on to number 8. Now, that previous point leads me on to something that I think is one of the highest impact but lowest effort interventions available, which is simply increasing your daily steps and your general movement throughout the day. This is what we call neat non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and I've done a video on this specifically a couple of weeks ago. It's all of the energy that you burn that isn't formal exercise, and the time that you spend being sedentary, basically just sat down doing nothing, independent of how much you exercise, worsens glucose control. So even if you go to the gym every morning for an hour, but then you sit down in the car, at the office, and then at home for the vast majority of the day, you are still a sedentary person. And there's actually really fascinating data on post-meal walking specifically. So a study in Sports Medicine found that even a 10-minute walk after eating reduced the post-meal glucose spike significantly compared to sitting. Now, the differences in metabolic health between people who otherwise look similar often come down to need. One person is on their feet all day moving constantly. The other is sedentary between gym sessions. The HbA1c profiles look completely different. Number 9 on the list is all about improving your sleep. So sleep is one that doesn't get anywhere near enough attention in this context, and it really should. So when you're sleep deprived, if you're a doctor working night shifts, and we're talking about regularly getting less than 6 or 7 hours, your cortisol level goes up, insulin sensitivity drops, and fasting glucose rises. And there's a really well-known study from the University of Chicago where healthy young adults restricted to just 4 hours of sleep for 6 nights developed insulin resistance comparable to early type 2 diabetes within that single week. Just think about that for a second. That is crazy to think about. And there are other studies showing that chronic sleep restriction raises your HbA1c even when your diet is held pretty constant. You could be eating pretty well and exercising regularly, and poor sleep can completely undermine it. The target is 7 to 8 hours. It's not optional if you're serious about metabolic health. Now, alcohol at number 10 is another one that I need to be direct about. If your HbA1c is rising, alcohol deserves serious attention. Now, your liver metabolizes alcohol as a priority. It effectively puts everything else on hold, including proper glucose regulation. This increases liver fat over time, it impairs insulin signaling, and it raises your triglycerides. It's not that an occasional glass of wine is a metabolic catastrophe, but if you're drinking regularly, even if that's just a couple of cans of beer a night, and you're wondering why your numbers aren't moving, then that's a variable that's worth examining and being really honest about. Number 11 is all about visceral fat. Now, I've mentioned this a couple of times, and I want to come back to it separately because it's that important. Visceral fat isn't just passive stored energy. It's biologically active tissue. It secretes inflammatory cytones, it drives insulin resistance directly, and it correlates very strongly with HbA1c. Now, there are plenty of studies out there that show how reducing the amount of fat around your liver and your pancreas by eating the right things can actually restore normal insulin secretion in people with type 2 diabetes. The frustrating thing is that you can't target visceral fat specifically, you can't spot reduce it, but what happens when you improve insulin sensitivity through all of the other interventions that we're discussing is that visceral fat tends to be preferentially mobilized. It shrinks as your metabolic health improves. Number 12 is all about managing your chronic stress. And from my experience, this is really underappreciated as a metabolic variable. And this is something that I want to emphasize because people often think of stress as psychological. Well, it's not only psychological, it's biochemical. Chronic cortisol elevation causes your liver to dump glucose into the bloodstream through a process called gluconeogenesis. It causes insulin resistance at the receptor level. It measurably shows up in your blood sugar. And I've seen patients doing everything right with diet and exercise, and their HbA1c is stubbornly elevated. And when you dig into their lifestyle, they're under enormous sustained stress. Stress management isn't just a soft intervention. It's so important for your health. And there are lots and lots of ways to address this, and I'll do a specific video on this in the next couple of weeks, because this is a really, really important topic. Number 13 is time-restricted eating, and this is often called intermittent fasting. Now, it's a tool that I think works really well for some people and is completely unnecessary for others. The evidence is strongest for what's called early time restricted feeding, where you're eating earlier in the day and not eating late into the evening. What we know from the research is that early time restricted feeding not only improves insulin sensitivity, but it also reduces your blood pressure, and that's without any weight loss. And what this does is it aligns your eating with your natural circadian rhythms and reduces overnight glucose exposure. But I want to be clear here, this isn't a magic bullet necessarily. If it fits your lifestyle and helps you eat less or better, then great. If it doesn't suit you, then don't force it. There are plenty of other levers out there. Now, reducing ultra-processed foods with whole foods deserves its own separate mention, even though it overlaps with some of what I've already talked about in this video, because this is perhaps one of the most significant points. So, a landmark randomized controlled trial from the NIH, Kevin Hall's group, showed that people eating an ultra-processed diet consumed around 500 more calories per day and gained weight compared to people eating a whole food diet, even when both diets were matched for macronutrients and they were able to eat as much as they wanted. Ultra-processed foods are really strongly associated with diabetes, and there are lots of different mechanisms at play: high glycemic load, low fiber content, poor satiety, often containing additives that affect your gut microbiome. Now, swapping out ultra-processed foods for whole foods improves glucose stability even without explicitly counting calories or tracking your macros. What this tells us is that food quality matters at least as much as food quantity. And finally, we have medication. And I want to position this really correctly. So lifestyle interventions come first always. But medication when appropriate and when lifestyle changes haven't been sufficient, this isn't a failure necessarily. Metformin improves insulin sensitivity and has a strong safety record going back decades. Now, the UK prospective diabetes study showed that it reduced major diabetes-related endpoints significantly, and it remains a cornerstone of this sort of treatment. GLP-1 receptor agonists reduce HbA1c substantially and have real cardiovascular benefits. SGLT2 inhibitors lower glucose by increasing the renal excretion and also have impressive cardiac and kidney protective data. Now, medication are tools. They should be used when indicated, always individualized to the person, and ideally alongside lifestyle interventions, rather than instead of them. Now, the reason HbA1c responds to this kind of systemic approach is that it isn't just one thing. It's not a single defect that you can fix with a single intervention. You can't fix it with a pill or a supplement you can buy from another YouTube doctor. It's the cumulative output of your insulin sensitivity, your muscle mass, your liver fat, your sleep quality, your stress hormones, your gut health. When you pull multiple levers simultaneously, the effects compound. Biology responds to consistency, not extremes. You don't need to do everything perfectly. You just need to do most things consistently over time and keep improving things slowly over a few years. Now, let me just leave you with this. In the last 10 years of emergency medicine, I rarely admit somebody to the hospital with a normal HbA1c. I've admitted plenty of people with a high HbA1c, often with kidney failure, neuropathy, retinal damage, heart disease, strokes, cancer. And the thing that stays with you is that at the earliest stages of this process, much of this is reversible. Pre-diabetes absolutely can be reversed. Early type 2 diabetes can often be put into remission, but you have to catch it early. You have to act when the number is still 44, not wait until it's 75 and the complications have already arrived. Small changes to your lifestyle over time, where you're constantly improving, where it feels manageable over the course of 20 years, can mean the difference between living freely when you're older or being on 10 medications and dependent on others. Listen,